Keeping vigil at the threshold of a fire horse year. When time stands still. On the mantel above the fireplace in the old house where we landed out of desperation, design, and determination, I set a clock Christopher made from airplane parts. Its exposed hands were delicate, so I carried it carefully during the move. I placed it above the fireplace in the same room where the medical company assembled my father's hospital bed, moving him, too, with the same care. A few months later, as I watched an employee from the company dismantle the bed for the last time, I asked whether spirits ever attach themselves to the items this man delivered, repurposed and recycled, in a staging of constant endings and suffering. It's never happened to me, but others have experienced it, he said. If a spirit comes to visit me, I hope it's a good one that will let me ask questions and guide me. May we all have good spirits attached to our things. In the weeks leading up to my father's passing, a video of Nurse Amy on the FX show Dying for Sex went viral on all my feeds. In the clip, Amy enthusiastically leads the show's characters through what to expect in the biological stages of dying. Death is not a mystery, she says. It's not a medical disaster. You can watch the clip in a link in the show notes and also on the original piece for this week on Stable Roots. As death approaches, the brain shifts out of its usual future-oriented mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, sequencing, and tracking time, becomes less dominant, while deeper systems tied to sensation, memory, and emotional meaning take over. This change is driven by declining oxygen levels, metabolic changes, and the body's prioritization of basic survival and comfort. When the brain is no longer organizing experience into before and after, time stops feeling linear. The present moment expands and becomes dense. There's also strong evidence from trauma and threshold state research, including hospice psychology, that when the nervous system enters a state of sustained vigilance, what caregivers experience and what the dying body mirrors, time perception slows dramatically. This is the same mechanism reported by people in near-death experiences, accidents, and profound grief. The amygdala heightens awareness while the brain stops tracking duration in a conventional way. What feels like time stopping is actually time losing its narrative structure. As death draws near, time stops behaving the way we're taught it should. It no longer moves forward in clean lines or obeys clocks and calendars. Time thickens and stretches. The hours lose their edges and days blur into one long vigil where nothing happens and everything happens all at once. The world keeps moving, traffic lights change, emails arrive, holidays come and go, but inside the room where someone is actively dying, time loses meaning. You wait without waiting and listen for breath the way you once listened for footsteps. You learn that our bodies know how to slow things down when they need to, creating a container where endings aren't speedy or tidy or staged. Being the witness becomes the only measure of progress. Our bodies know how to die. As the days blended together in the room where my father slowly faded, the clock Christopher built, propped above the mantel, stopped. Should we also cover the mirrors when he passes? My mother asked. As we move from the 9-year cycle of the wood snake into the approaching time of the fire horse in the Chinese zodiac, there's no better time to talk of endings and beginnings. The Chinese New Year falls in February, so we have some time to sink in, take stock, and soothe our lessons with all the wisdom we've gained through the process. A mirror into ourselves. When we moved into Lavender Hill, we inherited a tall Victorian hall tree with a marble shelf. The seller claimed it had been passed down to each new owner, so we eyed the mirror with reverence as we settled my father into the easily accessible dining room. As we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, the hall tree stood sentry, witnessing as our lives fell into a rhythm that felt predestined. Time carrying us to the moment we could finally call home. Later, I discovered the hall tree wasn't present with the previous owners of the house at the turn of the millennium, but like all good stories, intention is a value ratio that trumps truth. It feels good to think the mirror has been there a while. Across cultures, mirrors have long been covered when someone is dying or has just died, because mirrors were believed to hold time in place. In Jewish mourning traditions, mirrors are covered so the living are not pulled back into the ordinary world of appearances during sacred events. In Victorian folklore, mirrors were veiled to prevent the soul from becoming trapped, or to prevent the living from being startled back into themselves at the threshold moment. In Appalachian and European folk traditions, mirrors were said to confuse the boundary between the worlds, reflecting a reality that no longer applied once death entered the room. What all these stories hold in common is an understanding that death alters time and perception so completely that reflective surfaces become inappropriate. When someone is dying, the room is no longer about looking forward or outward, but about being aware and present to what is happening inside the walls. Covering mirrors is a way of acknowledging that linear time has loosened its grip, that the ordinary rules are suspended, and that there is nothing more to advance. The only actions needed are to hold space for what is happening in the moment and to provide comfort and care. Hospice clinicians often observe that patients stop orienting themselves to clocks, days, or sometimes weeks before death. I labeled my father's withdrawal as agitation and confusion, but it ended up being his withdrawal from chronological time. Researchers describe this as a transition from chronos, measured time, to kairos, or experience time, a shift that replaces minutes with meaning. For those sitting bedside, the effect is mirrored. Grief researchers describe vigil time as liminal, a state in which the mind cannot progress because the outcome is both known and unknown. The nervous system holds everything still because moving forward would mean crossing the threshold alone. So when it feels like time is standing still, it's a body and brain doing something very old and very human, slowing the world enough to let an ending be witnessed, experienced, and crossed. Outside the space where we held vigil for my father, everything was normal and mundane. I adjusted stirrups for riders and threw the evening hay. A random stranger drove up one afternoon and pontificated on the value of clean spaces and natural landscapes. "This is all we have between us and death," the stranger said, stretching his arms out towards the fields and hoping we'd invite him in for an unscheduled, cost-free horse experience. "I'd usually try to fit you in for a session, but my father is dying," I said. "Where is your father?" the stranger asked. "Inside the house." I pointed up the hill towards the straight back of the farmhouse with its uniform Christmas wreaths on the windows. "Why isn't your father in a hospital if he's dying?" the stranger asked, shocked. He took a step back from me and started inching toward his car. "Because dying is part of nature," I said, "and it's safer and more comfortable at home." The stranger fled from the frightening interlude of time's reminder on his idyllic day of driving around the countryside. But he slowed his car to snap a photo of the lovely fields before he pulled out of the driveway as quickly and unexpectedly as he'd arrived. I never covered the mirror on the hall tree or the one above the still clock on the mantel, but I watched them differently as the days went on. The mirror was a witness, like me, another presence in the rooms that had stood long enough through wars and living to know a thing or two about endings. I hadn't really thought about the number of mirrors in the house until my father began to slip away from this world. Inside the house, the clocks had stopped. Outside on the farm, people kept skimming the surface of things, snapping photos, and aching for prepackaged beauty without having to do the work of making it. The mirrors stood between those worlds, between fields and furniture, between folklore and fact, between living and leaving. And inside the house, we did the only thing that made sense. We kept watch. 2025 turned my world upside down, and I invite you to walk this path with me through every honest word I write here on Stable Roots. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a newsletter, you're helping preserve a piece of land, a way of living, and a commitment to slow, meaningful work in a world that rarely pauses. If you've made it this far, you already know the heart behind my writing. Your support means more than I can ever fully express, even for someone whose job is words. Thank you for backing my work and for tending this farm alongside me. Keeping room. To keep vigil is an old phrase, older than hospitals, monitors, and visiting hours. It comes from the practice of staying awake through the night so no one would have to cross a threshold alone. To keep meant to tend, to remain, to guard the space, and to stay present long after the world expected you to sleep. Holding vigil is a newer way of saying the same thing, shaped by the language of tending and care. It asks for nurturing and attention. Both phrases point to the same human instinct. When time loosens its grip and the ordinary rules fall away into the oldest rules of existence, someone keeps watch. When my father started transitioning towards death, I missed my chance to speak to his ghosts. He became deeply agitated 2 weeks before passing, and his room was filled with visitors that only he could see. I mistook this for a UTI because he had a long history of hallucinations with infections, but the hospice nurses kept turning my metaphorical shoulders and pointing me to notice him slipping from this world and into the next. And then one morning, my father woke with absolute clarity. I spooned cereal into his mouth. Terminal lucidity refers to a brief, often unexpected return of mental clarity, alertness, or meaningful connection that can occur shortly before death, even in people who have been unresponsive, agitated, or cognitively impaired. It's been documented for centuries, though medicine struggled for a long time to take it seriously because it doesn't fit neatly into a linear model of decline. What's important and often misunderstood is that terminal lucidity is not improvement, it's a transition. Clinicians don't fully understand the mechanism, though theories include changes in brain chemistry, reduced fear responses, and shifts in oxygen and neurotransmitters as the body lets go. Families often experience it as a gift, but also a rupture of expectations because it arrives after the hardest parts and brings a surge of hope. In older traditions, this moment was understood as a gathering of the self before departure, a final coherence. Modern language calls it lucidity, but many people who witness it recognize it as something more profound. The agitation has finished its work, and the person is no longer fighting their passage. I'd kept watch for a week as my father slipped from agitation to a brief rally to active dying. My attention was fully on him, but it also seemed like my vigil held him in place, like I was willing him to stay in this world by my watching. I needed a push that would allow me and him to let go. Ask a different question. Tamar Reno is my sister in spirit. and my soul being, and my constant repository of wisdom. We aren't able to touch base as often as we would like, but when we do, we make up for lost time. She called when my father was days into unconsciousness. A monitor beside my bed kept track of the long, drawn-out silences between his breaths and the rattle in his throat. Tamar told me about a hospice nurse who once explained to her that the length of time people spend in the weird space of in between, not quite here and not quite there, correlates to the unfinished work they have on earth. Our nervous system tells the truth about our relative safety. Medicine can't map inner work onto a timeline, but anyone who has sat at the bedside of someone dying knows that some struggle longer against the current, while others find a quieter way through to the other side. I don't say this to compare virtue to completion, but to note how a nervous system that has practiced regulation, that has known repair or reassurance, often has an easier time standing down when the work of staying alive is finished. Agitation, resistance, and restlessness are signs of a system still mobilized, still trying to protect against something it cannot outrun. Calm, long sleep, and withdrawal from the world aren't signs of readiness so much as safety. I saw this with my father. As the days went on and his system finally stilled, time seemed to loosen its grip. Nothing about that felt like an achievement, but it felt relational, like something in him had been accepted well enough to allow the next step to happen. After talking to Tamar, I sat beside my father and told him that I loved him. I let him know that he had the power to let go on his own, that I couldn't do this for him. I told him it was okay to move on. The monitor was quiet as I fell asleep. By morning, my father was gone. The morning light. I don't know if my father needed me to give permission or if I was the one searching for the okay. But at some fixed point after the house settled for the night, after the clock had stopped, my work of watching was finished, and my father sighed into the next world. I had nothing else to hold in place, and my attempt at control over the course of 2025 had been serious for so many things. Farmland I didn't own, people who no longer fit into my life, horses who had reached their own final breath. By morning, the room my father lay in had changed. The air was different throughout the house. The monitor beside my bed was silent. My father's bed was there, and the mirror in the foyer still reflected back the threshold where his body rested, still and finished and at peace. Outside, the farm was awake and asking for feed buckets and hay flakes and ordinary attention. Time had returned to its familiar pressure, ticking and pushing me forward, but something inside of me was indelibly changed. I had seen what happens when time loosens its meaning and when keeping vigil is the only thing of value. We don't talk much about how to let people and animals die, and how profoundly maturing the vigil is for those holding space. We talk about fighting and fixing and holding on, but being present for my father taught me that there is a moment when love stops insisting on something in return and begins to allow things to happen as they should. I finally realized that the most human thing I can do is step back and trust a body to finish what it knows how to do. My father died during the night, and when the light returned in the morning, time moved forward again. But it did so altered by the knowledge that it can stop when it needs to, and that often the greatest act of care is knowing when to let it and all the things that have reached their time go. I'm sending this out on New Year's Day, and soon it will be the start of the Fire Horse year. Fire Horse years don't ask for permission. They move, they break barriers, and they demand truth at full force. Horses don't bargain with time, and fire never apologizes for what it consumes. This year, I'm walking forward with blistered hands and an unvarnished heart, stripped down by loss, but sharpened by what remains. Mourning doesn't clean up the messes or offer tidy endings. It brings a light raw enough to reveal what survived, what's meant to move on, and what I finally have to let go of so this body, my own stubborn and hopeful body, can keep going. Thank you for being a part of my journey. Love, Kim.